Scott Welch, Muscle Insider. We're here with the legendary Shawn Ray, global ambassador for Mutant. How are you doing today, Shawn?
I'm doing good, my man. Just back from Columbus, Ohio, and another Arnold Classic is in the
Now,
books.
is it? I mean, did Nick Walker really dominate? I mean, you were right there, front row. Tell us your perspective.
Complete domination. I felt every round. It wasn't close. There was no debate. And the only controversy I saw was that Steve Kuclo wound up in third instead of second.
That was weird for me too, because in the prejudging, they brought the two of them out to pose near the end of it. And everyone was just thinking, okay, well, it's first and second, first and second. And Ian Valliere from Canada here, he's obviously in third. And that's caused a lot of controversy. Do you think his conditions slipped between the prejudging and night show for Valliere and or for Kuclo, but improved for Valliere from what you saw?
No, I don't. I mean, I actually thought Steve looked better at the finals. And like most people I was sitting around, we thought Steve was in a solid second place after prejudging. So it was one of those eye-openers. Like, do we hear this right? Like, wait a minute, what just happened? Like, a lot of people were surprised. I think where Ian, lost some points with me was a lot of it was in between poses. He couldn't control the midsection. However, he could pull a vacuum on the front of a bicep pretty good, but in between shots, even like there, looking down, at his body, rubbing the oil in, he would relax the stomach, whereas Kuclo didn't have a stomach. He didn't have a gut. He had a little bit better lines. He was a bigger, fuller bodybuilder. Look, they both have their faults. Ian clearly was not at his best. This, I believe, was his third show this year. Steve Kuklo's second show of the year. I thought Steve was much improved by comparison to where Ian beat him in Texas. Where Steve loses ground is on his back, but again, that's not Ian's strong point either. I do prefer Steve Kuklo's calves, his sweeping quadriceps, the overall girth. I mean, I think they both are equally weak in the midsection department. There's some detail you just do not see on either frame. But I think overall, the pleasing physique, you kept coming back to Steve Kuklo, not because he was bigger. I just thought he was just a little more pleasing to look at. Ian sometimes it was kind of falling apart, kept pulling his shorts up his butt. Not really a good look if you don't have the striated glutes, which he did not have. But the constant tinkering with the posing brief in the back wasn't right. And
some striations there, Shawn. There is some striations there, and some
obviously we got different opinions on what striations look like.
Yeah.
And there's varying degrees, but to pull them up your butt, you better have some striations. I just didn't see them to the degree that I'm used to. Remember, I go off of personal experience, and you got to look at Dexter Jackson. You got to look at Renell Janvier. You got to look at myself and Rich Gaspari. I know what striations look like.
Yep.
And those weren't there. So that was kind of a distraction. But I just thought overall the polish of a Steve Kuclo was the reason he was the last to pose with Nick Walker at prejudging. And I kind of thought they were both equally the same at the finals.
Did you feel that Valliere was running out of gas with the posing? I know that recently Amanda Latona had made some accusations, and there's some things going through the internet on that.
Well, it wasn't. Listen, it's not an accusation if that's what you're watching. He was struggling a bit, which is why the stomach was relaxing a lot, because a lot of these bodybuilders, they're trying to breathe and they're not breathing through their chest, they're breathing through their stomach, which draws even more attention to the stomach, and that distension becomes a little bit more noticeable. The body language, the heavy, deep breathing, and it draws attention to you in a way that you shouldn't, especially when you're sweating and you're wiping your body constantly. It tells you that you're struggling a little bit.
Now, why did they move Ian in the center, and then later they put Steve in the center? Was this just to allow a complete fair comparison and improve the entertainment value? What, in your experience, would this have been done for?
Yeah, that's obviously giving every bodybuilder the same equal opportunity. I think they all took turns standing in that center spot.
Yeah.
So Steve Weinberger, head judge, has gotten very good at giving everybody a fair look, whether it's for lighting or whether it's just for positioning, that if you're in the top three, you should get an opportunity to stand on either side, but most definitely each athlete should have the right to stand in the middle to see how they stack up and compare. I think that was a good call. And Steve Kuclo had his moment in the sun standing in the middle as well.
Calves. Arnold really hammered the people in this show in the men's classic physique, especially, but then obviously in the open, calves seem to be a focal point. Have you seen that sort of become less emphasized over the years based on from your experience back in the day? Arnold touched on the arm. I believe it's the arm, calf, and neck used to be the same measurement or very close to it. But it seems like now, obviously, we're not talking Kuklo and Nick Walker, who have massive, massive calves. But have you seen that trend kind of change over the
Well,
years?
it's not a trend. I think it depends on what show you're watching and when. There are things when it comes to what gets down to the nitty gritty, and it's a close show. It can come down to noticing somebody's calves. And while Ian is very slight and weak in the calves on both legs, a former Arnold Classic champion by the name of Dennis Wolf and by the name of Dexter Jackson are right there with Ian in the calf department. They're just missing in action. And he's also standing next to some guys that have some relatively decent size, girth on their calves. So you're exposed even more. The trained eye cannot overlook that. You cannot ignore that. So the commentary was just and necessary because people are looking at the complete physique. Some athletes and some fans don't like to hear the criticism, but listen, what Arnold did and does, I've taken a page out of his book a long time ago, and that's give the athlete that's on that stage something to come back, watch, and listen to. Now he can go back in the gym and try to correct. If we sit here and pat these guys on their strengths, listen, Nick Walker's quads are enormous. Look at the size of Steve Kuklo's legs. And wow, Ian is very wide with his lats. They can't do anything with that when they go back in the gym. But if you talk about the lack of size on Ian's calves, Ian's going to hear that. And he's going to go back to the gym and he's going to have something to work with. He's hearing me say that his glutes were not striated. Therefore, you shouldn't pull your posing trunks up your butt until you get some cuts, some real rips. Well, maybe he's going to try to develop that even more before he does it the next time. These are baby peekaboo, almost not quite ready for prime time striations that you're talking about when you look at that.
Sure.
If you look at a bodybuilder that's got striated glutes, you'll see he's got a long way to go before he hikes those up his butt. And when you do it prematurely, it's distracting because the element of surprise is not there. You're like, okay, what are we looking for here? You keep pulling them up. We need some more detail there. So let's go back to the drawing board and rip those glutes up. And the same can be said if Arnold was talking about the lack of chest development. You go back in the gym and you start developing those areas where you get the constructive criticism. Listen, Arnold doesn't know these guys individually or personally, and neither do I. So there's nothing to be gained by critically criticizing what our naked trained eye sees. When you hear this criticism, rather than getting offended by it, go back to the gym and do something about it because that criticism is there to help you. There's a reason why Nick Walker won. He's harder. He was holding his poses longer. He just was thicker in all the right places. From the back, he beat both of those guys soundly, and he was the littlest guy on the stage. Sure. So he brought the freak factor. It's not a knock against the other two guys. Steve Kuclo, go back in the gym and get a little bit harder. Pose like you're posing right here, but do it the 2 or 3 days before so you can get harder, so you're not emanating a lot of sweat on the stage. Steve and Ian were equally sweating in areas that Nick Walker was not because he was just a little bit better conditioned.
This is very well said. Do you think that posing practice is really not happening in the off season and then pre-contest? These guys are not conditioned. I mean, we all know the stories of, Frank Zane doing the 1 hour of posing practices. You obviously were a master of posing when you were competing. Is that an art that's kind of been lost? I mean, obviously Arnold pointed out the holding of the poses being necessary. What is your take on that?
I think people are now starting to get wind of that. I mean, Rami, we believe almost unanimously that he won the Olympia because he was able to get in and get out of the pose first and last. He looked like he had put in the work. We know if you've been on that stage, you can't fake it. When it's time to hit the front double bicep and you're the first one in and the last one out, it's because you practice that. Getting up in here is easy, but now holding it, making it look easy in the face, in the quads, in the midsection for 10, 15 seconds, and then doing it again and again and again, you have to do that before you hit center stage. More and more athletes, I think, are getting wind of that. I think Nick Walker took a page out of Big Rami and showed us that he was in that kind of condition and shape. And I believe his trainer, Matt Jansen, will tell you that that's what they did. I'm not so sure Ian can say the same thing or Steve can say the same thing, but we know that if they did, they still have some ways to go. They got more work ahead of them, and they should continue doing that for the next couple of weeks for the Olympia. I don't think Steve Kuklo is qualified, but we know that Ian is. And if Ian's going to get better, he's going to have to get better in the posing. I talked about the transition. What he's doing in between the poses is very noticeable. So you can call it splitting hairs, but you're on the biggest stage at the Olympia. We're going to see everything you do, and we're going to pay attention to everything that you don't do. So if there's anything that he needs to walk away with is in between poses, he's got to keep it tight. In the pose, he's got to keep it tight. You cannot be fidgeting with this oil on your body. You know, if there's water coming out, it's because you didn't do the posing on the run up. You got to do more. Sweat that water out before you hit that stage. That's good constructive criticism. And I think there was a lot of valuable insight to what Arnold was saying. Listen, he loves bodybuilding more than us. That was a show he put on in the middle of a pandemic, and he didn't have to. He didn't have the audience, didn't have the expo, didn't have the sponsors. A lot of things. He had a hurt calf. There were a lot of reasons why Arnold could have pulled the plug on this show, but yet the fan and supporter of bodybuilding that he is, he went ahead and put it on. So it's up to the athletes to listen to the critique he was giving, because he doesn't speak to hear himself speak. And if he's talking about
lost $1 million.
Well, listen, sometimes in certain situations, losing $1 million is a nice tax write-off. Okay. Sure. So what you and I consider a loss can be someone like him a gain. And remember, I think the prize money was like $400 something thousand, right? He did have sponsorship. He didn't have a full house. But the price of doing business is that you sometimes lose money to make money. Yeah. How many years was he in the red? Like, how many years was he making money? Sure. Yeah. So the Arnold Classic wins even when it loses. We have to be thankful that Arnold forges ahead and has the institution of the Arnold Classic. So when he's criticizing what he's watching, it's not because he doesn't like the athlete. Unlike when I criticize an athlete. If I criticize an athlete, I must have something out for him, right? or I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. I've only been doing this over 30 years professionally, and I get paid for my opinions, which is why they keep bringing me back, because some of them are polarizing. But I don't have a horse in this race. These are guys coming up behind me. I want to see them all do well. Listening to Arnold break these guys down, I thought was a very good lesson. And who's going to hear the criticism and what are they going to do with it? Right. So our job is to constructively criticize the physique so the athlete can become a better athlete. We'll let the crowd applaud them. We'll let the crowd and the fans celebrate them. But as expert commentators, we're looking for the one with the fewest flaws. And on the weekend, Nick Walker had the fewest flaws.
Okay, just going to go now over to each of them, and I kind of want to get your comments. So Ian Valliere, what would you say that he has to improve on? You mentioned obviously the transitions, the posing, conditioning on the posing. Obviously, I mean, you mentioned his back. I mean, what is your advice at this stage for Ian?
Yeah, the chest, he's going to have to hammer that chest like nobody's business. He's going to have to really bring up the upper pecs and just stay on top of those. Those calves are very reminiscent of Dennis Wolf, a former Arnold Classic champion. They're paltry by comparison to the quadricep. And when he's in the relaxed pose or even the lat spread pose, I think he's going to have to figure out how to get the leg separation in the upper quadricep a little bit more, so that it does take away our attention from the calves, which are very distracting, especially from the rear. These aren't something that are going to grow overnight. Calves take a very long time to get. Sometimes they never arrive. And with that being said, it makes his legs look too big for his calves, which are pretty anemic. But Dennis Wolf made a career and won some shows. Dexter Jackson had a very successful career. And we can even talk about Ronnie Coleman when it comes to the slight calves, and Tony Pearson for that matter. Sure. But Ian's done very well with what he has to work with. I just think that stop trying to overemphasize the glutes or improve them, because we know what ripped glutes are supposed to look like. So if you're going to highlight them, then do a little bit more with them. And I don't know what he's doing to develop them, but I know that for me, trying to get my glutes ripped, I would do a lot of lunges, did a lot of stiff-legged deadlifts, and where I was able to squeeze my glutes. and one leg, single leg presses. But either way, you got to show us something if you're going to try to show that area. The triceps could use a little bit more size on the triceps. His arms look good. I just think his horseshoe needs to be a little bit thicker, which means he's going to have to do a little bit more weight on the bar.
I think the one thing that is good about Ian that no one can contest is he continues to make improvements show after
Yeah.
show after show, year after year. And a lot of these guys get to a certain point and then they don't sort of continually improve. And he's shown us he can.
Yeah, I think
Could,
that I think we're splitting hairs on
yeah,
the
sure.
critique here. He's clearly gotten better. He's coming into his own, and the two victories this year solidified that from a year ago. He's got the potential, but he's got to continue to work on those hard to get areas. I mean, calves are very hard to develop, and so are the triceps for that matter.
Kuclo, obviously, I think he's 6 feet, the largest man in the contest around, I think it's 268 on stage, a little bit down from Texas, which was good because that was a feedback they got from that show is he needed to be a little bit leaner. Where would you go from here with Steve?
Yeah, he's going to have to figure out a way to develop the middle back. A big guy like that, I would like to see him start doing some chin-ups. I'd like to see him really thicken up the middle portion of his back. He's got the deltoids, and then it disappears into absolutely nothing. I don't know if he's competing a little bit too heavy, but he definitely has to get a little more detail in the midsection. And of course, I'd like to see him get some separation in the hamstrings. He's a big guy, so something's going to have to give. You're going to have to give away some poundage in order to get the form down to develop the middle back. But if I'm him, every one of my back workouts are just knockout, drag down wars, right? Because you don't have to lift a lot of weight to develop the back. And maybe he might want to switch up and do some high repetition workouts, some drop sets, even giant sets, and get the fundamentals of the back exercises so he can feel the muscles rather than trying to hurl the weight.
Yeah, very good advice. Justin Rodriguez, I had not even really thought of this guy, and I'd heard a little bit of buzz and I was like, oh yeah, who is this guy? But I'd have to say he was a bit of the talk of the show in a good way. And we'll obviously get to Akeem Williams on the talk of the show in a different way. But Justin, I mean, this guy's just got a lot of potential now. What would you say his improvement should be moving forward?
Yeah, he reminds me of a Phil Williams. And for those of you that don't know Phil Williams, go back and Google the 1985 NPC USA and the NPC national champion. He went on to compete and won Mr. Olympia, but he's got a very similar physique to Phil Williams, very slight in the front quadricep area. Needs a little bit more thickness and girth as well as detail to match those big billowing biceps of his. The knock on him, his shoulders are a little bit too developed. All right, I said that they were kind of suspicious in one of the shows. I just think his shoulders kind of overwhelm the tricep. And if he gets a little bit more thickness on the tricep to match up with those shoulders, he'll be good on the upper body side. He's got to bring up the hamstrings, get a little bit more meat on those quadriceps. And of course, his calves are slight, similar to Ian Valliere. He's got to get those calves up. Great lines, though.
Nice. Akeem Williams, at Muscular Development had him rated as first place contender, like the odds on favorite to win this. Dave Palumbo had felt the same thing going into this, but
once again, Dave Palumbo is wrong, and again, he's constantly wrong. So listening to RX Muscle is mistake number one. But Akeem, I would have had in the top 3 coming into this show on paper. I definitely would not have had him beating Justin or Nick Walker based on what I saw Nick Walker at the New York Pro and what I saw Akeem at the Chicago Pro. Akeem is a victim of just like, again, the thick skin is very thick. He's got to thin it out, but he missed his peak here. And I don't know if it's because he competed earlier in the year or if because he's trying to still come down for the Mr. Olympia, but he looked flat. He just didn't have the wow factor. And he's about the same height, maybe even a little taller than Nick Walker, but you can see it when they got to the back where Akeem kind of faded next to Justin or with Nick. I don't know why I keep calling Nick Justin, but Nick's hamstrings and calves really exposed Akeem Williams here. Akeem had the thickness. Again, he's got those very high lats, which Nick Walker does not. Nick Walker's comes right down to his waist. Akeem start midway up, kind of like a Dexter Jackson, very high lats. But here you can kind of see when he's not on, he's beatable by a lot of different people.
Yeah.
Like Justin should not beat Akeem, right? Akeem's got so much muscle, but Justin has such better shape
Yeah.
and his shape was overpowering the muscle size that Akeem had, minus the ripped detail that Akeem needs in order to win. Akeem reminds me of a bodybuilder, Orville Burke, from way back
Orville
in the
Burke.
day.
Yeah, that's
Orville
right.
Burke got in the top 6 of one of the Mr. Olympias one time, but Orville was big and thick and wide, but he just wasn't really ripped, had very thick skin, hard to see the detail because he was so dark. Akeem has to be 100% to be in the conversation, and he wasn't.
Sergio Oliva Jr. won Best Poser Award. Obviously, he is already announced another show he's going to be doing this year. But what were your thoughts on him, on Sergio Jr.?
Yeah, again, the posing round was not something to brag about in the
Sure.
open men's bodybuilding. I
Yeah.
mean, somebody had to win that show, that award, and it wasn't because it was a spectacular performance. It's just that men's professional posing has gone so far down that you have to give it to someone, and Sergio just happened to have a little bit more going for him than the other guys, but it was not an outstanding performance. And Sergio was just carrying too much water from beginning to end. Sergio was wiping his body down as if the color was running off of his skin, almost as if there was a skin issue. But what it was water coming to the surface and coming out every time they got called out for posing. So he was more preoccupied with trying to either blend the oil and sweat together, or I'm not sure what he was doing by wiping his body, but it was pretty distracting. When he was actually flexing and posing, he was overemphasizing his face. It was a kind of a forced smile, and then at other times it was a forced grimace, and it was very distracting from actually the pose itself, because he's got a really nice bright smile, right? But when it gets too big, it's kind of jokerish, and when you get too menacing, you try to make your face look like it just didn't really kind of go with the condition. He didn't have the condition in order to pull that off. I think his most muscular in the tradition of his father was probably his best pose. But by not being in condition, you can see the weakness when he did the front double bicep. It was just, the torso's a little long, the quadriceps didn't have the detail, and he just wasn't it didn't pop, especially when you're standing relaxed. You could really see that there was a long torso there.
Okay, and the last piece we've got, seventh was Mohammed El Aman, and then we had Max Charles in eighth, Hosan Mustafa, and Sung Chung Lee. I believe he's from Korea. But great guys overall. But overall, I mean, it must have been a different vibe down in Columbus. I mean, you obviously been there so many times, won the show a number of times in the past, but must have been really surreal with the sort of without the expo like last year. They didn't have it. Not having
Yeah,
it
I mean,
year.
this is the second time. It's the second time. It was exactly what we expected. I actually enjoyed it. Maybe I'm getting old, but it was a nice time to walk in, sit down, and not be mentally distracted with what I'm either missing at the expo, what's happening on the other side of the arena, what's going on over here. I mean, this was all about the athletes. And it was kind of like walking into a movie theater where you sat down, you watched the show was over, and you got the hell out of there. So the benefactors were the fans being able to focus on these four divisions, and then also the athletes, because we weren't preoccupied or distracted with who won the strongman, who won the marathon, who was at your kids at the kids fair, and all the boosts and all the swag, and so many distractions Arnold Classic weekend that are going to come back in March of 2022 full swing. So what we missed, we can now appreciate as it comes back around. But for me, I was taken back in the early years of the 90s when it was just a physique show. It was a simpler time. I came out of that show refreshed. I remembered what I just saw. I wasn't distracted by other things. So I didn't feel like we missed anything. I was in a different headspace, being a sponsor with Mutant, presenter on the stage, and actually a fan in the audience. So while I put some content up for Digital Muscle throughout the night, I didn't have this distraction of wanting to be somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, listen, Shawn, thanks so much for doing this wrap up on us. You covered it like way better than I could have done, and I really appreciate it. And thanks to Mutant for sponsoring our contest coverage. I got some of the 9.7 BCA 9.7.
There you go.
Right here.
Good stuff.
And I'm looking forward to seeing you and the Mutant team at the Olympia next weekend.